From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics from Please Explain. I'm Jacqueline Maley. It's Friday, September 8. It used to be one of Australia's most beloved brands, synonymous with the national character and what it means to come home. But now Qantas is the most complained about company in Australia, and the Albanese government has been dragged into the controversy. This week's Qantas CEO Alan Joyce stepped down from his role early amid outrage over the airline's treatment of its customers. But the Albanese government is not getting away that easily. So why has Qantas lost the love of the Australian public? And how much collateral damage is being done to the Albanese government? Later, we will explore why pharmacists are heckling the government and give you an update on the voice referendum. Today, Deputy Federal Editor Stephanie Peatling and Chief Political Correspondent David Crowe join me to discuss the week in politics. Welcome to the show, David and Steph.
Hello.
Good to be back, Jackie.
Now, we've got a massive amount to get through today. We're just going to touch sort of more briefly on a few different issues. David, I want to go first to Qantas, which is in a world of pain. Alan Joyce, the former CEO, of course, has been grilled in recent weeks by a Senate committee for contributing to the cost of living crisis with high prices and by allegedly withholding flight credits for cancelled pandemic flights. Then this week he announced that he was going to leave his role as CEO 2 months early. And now a new Senate inquiry will scrutinise the government's decision to block Qatar Airways from expanding its services in Australia. That was a decision which hugely benefited Qantas. Also in the mix here, of course, is controversy over the PM's son being given exclusive Qantas chairman's lounge membership. David, it's a lot to unpack. What do we know, first of all, about the government's decision to block Qatar Airways from having additional flights into Australia?
Well, we know that there's a lot of consumer frustration with Qantas, and there's also a great concern about the level of competition in the aviation market because it's still recovering from the pandemic. Therefore, these sky-high prices for air tickets are a reality for a lot of Australians, domestically and internationally. And so there's a sense of, frustration with the government over its handling of this. And the government's been caught out because it's given multiple different reasons, sometimes totally contradictory, about its decision not to allow Qatar to increase its flights. Now, I don't think this is a story where, you have to champion Qatar Airways in order to sort of highlight the problem with competition. Whether that individual airline deserves more flights or not is a valid question. The point is that the Transport Minister, Catherine King, has never really given a coherent explanation for why the airline was turned away. She made the decision on July 10. That did help Qantas because it restricts a foreign competitor. And Catherine King, as the minister, has said this was in the national interest. Back in July, she denied that it was because of Qatar Airways' treatment, very invasive treatment, highly controversial treatment of female passengers in Doha in October 2020. And then on Thursday morning this week, she said that was a factor. So we're seeing contradictions from the government. They're not all on the same page on this, and it's highlighted, a lack of cohesion in the government over what their policy on aviation actually is.
And of course, we heard the other week, didn't we, Steph, that Stephen Jones, another government minister, gave a different rationale altogether for the decision and actually indicated that it was because it was commercially better for Qantas and as the national carrier, it was in the taxpayers' interest to sort of prop up the profits of that company.
Yes, that's right. I think those Stephen Jones comments have been interpreted in a number of ways. What he said in comments to the Financial Review last week, which was basically that it was not in anyone's interest for Qantas to fail, which is a huge claim to make, obviously, given that it's our main airline, and that seems like a self-evident statement. The problem with what's been going on from the government's perspective, as Crowe has highlighted, is that there is no narrative that the government has come upon that has given a reasonable explanation for why this has happened. So every time a different minister has a different answer, it just compounds the problem for them, which is that they basically can't explain to people why this decision was made for any other reason than that it was some kind of, as the opposition is very effectively saying, a protection racket to keep Qantas's commercial interests safe.
So the opposition has been going hard on this in question time this week.
This is a murky situation at best, Mr Speaker. The Minister's integrity is seriously in question.
And they've been particularly homing in on Catherine King, the Transport Minister, who, as you say, has had a lot of different stories about why this was in the national interest, this decision.
Mr Speaker, we need to hear from this Minister in a very direct way whether or not she met with or spoke with Alan Joyce prior to making a decision to stop Qatar flying into our country, which was of commercial benefit to Mr Joyce and to Qantas, and clearly to the detriment of the Australian flying public.
What else has the opposition been saying? What are they sort of trying to get at, that there was sort of undue influence being peddled here?
That's exactly what they're trying to get at, and they're doing a pretty good job at it. I mean, after a year in opposition in which their tactics in question time have not been amazing, shall we say, they can see that the government is not able to come up with an explanation that is satisfying the questions that are being asked about what has happened, and they are doing what oppositions always do, which is to zero in on a weak link. And at the moment, they see that weak link as Transport Minister Catherine King, someone who's not really known to the public, but is really displaying a different story every day, sometimes multiple different stories every day. And of course, that's making it very difficult for her to perform well in question time when the opposition is consistently asking her for reasons why this decision was made.
David, of course, Anthony Albanese has worked in politics a long time. He was a former transport minister, so he's had a long-standing relationship with Alan Joyce over many, many years. Is there a sense or an intuition that the government is too close to Qantas?
I think that's a problem for the government at the moment. We know that Anthony Albanese has stood side by side with Alan Joyce when Qantas backed the Yes campaign on the Indigenous voice. But we also know that Labor has, really gone after Qantas in the past on things like the sacking of workers, the treatment of workers, also sometimes the treatment of customers. So Labor has been robustly critical of Qantas at various points, but I think the government is exposed, and Anthony Albanese is personally exposed to this claim from Peter Dutton that there is this chumminess. The other day, Peter Dutton said in a radio interview that Alan Joyce and Anthony Albanese are always on the red carpet together.
Huge pressures. And look, the relationship between Alan Joyce and between Anthony Albanese is well documented. I mean, Anthony Albanese hasn't found a red carpet that he's not willing to trot down with Alan Joyce. That's just the reality of their relationship. So they've been proud about it up until this point. And now,
so that impression is really damaging to the government at the moment. And I think added to that, there's been this story about the Prime Minister's son having entry to the Chairman's Lounge at Qantas. So there is this sense of favours being given to the government, and that's a very bad look for the government.
Steph, I want to ask you about that. The Qantas Chairman's Lounge membership was extended to Anthony Albanese's son, Nathan, who's 20-something years old. It was a very unusual sort of thing to happen. How much is that one decision playing into the overall sort of optics of the government and Anthony Albanese's relationship with Alan Joyce and Qantas?
I think it plays into it quite significantly, Jackie, and not in a good way. It was the Financial Review that first reported that this Chairman's Lounge membership had been extended to the Prime Minister's son, who I think is 23, so a young lad. It has not been revealed if Qantas offered it to him or if it was a request from the Prime Minister. Either way, it's not a good look because it looks like a special favour was granted to someone who, on their own 2 feet, doesn't really have any claim to be in there. Every time Anthony Albanese is asked about this, he gives a very straight answer, which is that I have declared everything in accordance with the rules. That is a truthful and factual statement because he's not required to disclose this gift because it was given to his son. MPs are only required to make these disclosures on behalf of their spouses. But I think that just continues to make it look worse because every time someone says they've followed the rules but they don't go further than that and explain the circumstances in which they received something that ordinary people don't receive, it makes them look like they're dodging the question. I don't think it passes the pub test, and I'm sure that the Senate inquiry will be using every opportunity it can to find out how that benefit was extended to Nathan Albanese.
Okay, I want to turn quickly now to a different set of interests that are lobbying the government, which is the Pharmacists Guild. Steph, a very interesting and compelling scene played out in Parliament this week when a contingent of about 200 pharmacists yelled obscenities and heckled the Prime Minister. Before we get into why this happened, can you just set the scene for us? Because it was quite extraordinary, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of fun, I have to say. You know, chemists are not usually known for storming the barricades of Parliament House, are they? And yet in question time on Monday, it became very apparent that there were a lot, by which I mean, you know, more than 100 sitting in the public gallery.
Who will pay? Who will pay for 60 days? Who will pay? Who will pay for 60 days?
They were indeed heckling and being rude.
Order.
MPs were most affronted by this behaviour.
Mr Speaker, I'd like to raise a point of order under Standing Order 91E, disorderly conduct, from the members of the opposition and the members in the gallery. And I'd ask that security take care of these elements, because when we have...
Which is always entertaining, isn't it, when people whose standard of behaviour is often decried as being the worst in the country get upset that other people are being rude to them. What made it particularly interesting, I think, was that only late last week the government had declared that it had come to a truce with the Pharmacy Guild of Australia, which is the very powerful lobby group that represents chemists over the issue of the 60-day scripts. Pharmacists have been extremely unhappy about a measure that was outlined in the budget to allow people to have a longer period of medication granted to them, which meant that chemists were losing out on the fees from governments for issuing their scripts. The government was adamant that it would stay the course on this because it was a responsible cost of living measure for people to allow them to access those medications more cheaply. And yet the pharmacists have just refused to say die. They have done what they've been doing, which is continue to lobby. And on Monday, it came full circle and they brought it to the House of Representatives in very dramatic fashion.
David, just quickly, the background on that decision, the 60-day script decision. I mean, Mark Butler, the Health Minister, has talked about this being to do with the sort of ballooning costs of the health budget overall, you know, contributing to the structural deficit, and there being a lot of productivity measures within the health budget that they can sort of slim down what the taxpayer is funding. It seems, you know, on prima facie to be a good decision. Is the government going to back down on this 60-day script decision?
I don't see there's any way in which the government's going to back down. The 60-day script policy was announced in the May budget. When we surveyed voters, this was one of the most popular measures in the budget. Customers actually really like it. They don't have to go to the pharmacy as often. There's actually a saving to the government and to the consumer. So despite the protests, the government's not going to stop this policy. It started at the beginning of September, and it will continue. There is a negotiation between the government and the Pharmacy Guild over what's called the Community Pharmacy Agreement. This is a long-term agreement on basically the taxpayer subsidy for pharmacists. The Pharmacy Guild wants $3.3 billion more from taxpayers. So that's where the niggle's going to be. And I don't know whether the government's going to be all that enthusiastic about appeasing the pharmacists, because I think the protest this week looked really shocking for the pharmacists. The Pharmacy Guild says that it wasn't responsible for that protest in the House of Representatives. But the fact is, it backfired. I mean, it made patients want to go to a pharmacist who's impartial, who gives them calm medical advice, gives them the treatment that they need. They don't want to go to an angry retailer who's storming Parliament House because they're not getting the subsidies they expect from taxpayers. So I think the politics actually shifted in the government's favour as a result of that tactic in the House of Reps this week. It was a bad look. It's not what Australians want in Parliament. It's certainly not what I want to see when I'm sitting in the press gallery. And the point that was made to me was just imagine if they'd been union officials in high-vis vests instead of pharmacists in white jackets.
Dave and Steph, I want to turn briefly now to the Voice to Parliament referendum. It's something that I want to touch on every week for the next 5 weeks in the lead up to the referendum on October 14th because it's such an important event, both politically and historically. So this week, David, we had Opposition Leader Peter Dutton reiterating his pledge to hold a second referendum if this one on the Voice fails, which his referendum would focus on constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians without a voice to Parliament. What exactly is he doing here? What's he trying to signal to people?
I don't think he's signalling a genuine intent to solve the problem in the next term if the coalition wins power. I think he was obliged to say that, of course, he would go to another referendum because it's stated coalition policy that they seek change with a constitutional recognition of Indigenous people. So that answer had to be sort of dragged out of him on Sunday morning. But of course, it leads to the obvious message to voters that if it's no this year, then there's got to be another vote in the future. And that's, I think, something that is not really a net positive for the no campaign because it means that the message from Anthony Albanese and others is, well, look, get it done right the first time. Let's just get it done now. Now, I don't know which way it's going to play out by October 14, but I do think that that was one of the big things that happened this week. And we also heard a very passionate argument for the yes case from Marsha Langton, who's one of the key authors of the Indigenous Voice, the entire proposal, making the point that it's only an advisory council, Parliament will set the rules, and in her words, there's nothing to fear from this change. I don't know whether that's going to win the day in the end, but that's been the to and fro this week.
Marsha Langton also was keen to point out that, that this is it, this is the shot, in her words, that, if you vote no, it won't go into a pile that says, maybe we'll try again next time. It just means that this opportunity is shot, basically. Steph, I want to ask you about John Farnham. You grew up in the 80s. You know his 1986 hit, You're the Voice. And of course, this week, The Voice officially adopted that anthem and put out an ad with that song as its backing.
Over 90% of Australians voted yes, feeling the time had come to give Aborigines a fair go in the face of racial inequality.
We have the chance to turn the pages over.
Yet The Voice support has dropped again, according to the latest news poll, with 53% voting no, according to that poll. Do you think the John Farnham intervention has changed the campaign in any way?
I think the Yes campaign will certainly be hoping so. As someone who was around in the 80s, it's interesting that they've chosen a song that is recognisable to older people. I think that suggests they know that the people who are maybe soft-nosed and can be persuaded, or people who might have been voting yes but now have questions, they will identify with John Farnham. They will know that song. I think that's quite a clever message. I think also it's, what other song would you want to choose? I mean, how could you possibly choose a better campaign song than one that actually encapsulates the name of the proposal that you're putting in play?
You're the voice, try and understand it. Make a noise and make it clear. Whoa.
David, the family that is depicted in the Yes advertisement, the one with the John Farnham soundtrack, is very much a sort of middle Australian, suburban, white family. I noticed sort of no multicultural diversity at all within that ad. Do you think that says something about the kinds of voters that the Yes campaign is trying to target now?
So the challenge for the government is that they really need to communicate a more compelling message to those undecided Australian voters. And although we've had a lot of Indigenous leaders making the case for the Voice over many months, they've really got to get this message through to those wavering voters. And that does mean a lot of ordinary folks out in the suburbs. And I think that's where the John Farnham song comes in. I think it's quite effective as an advertising campaign. Bear in mind, it might not be seen by all that many people. I mean, it's been seen by people in the media. We've written about it, but it needs to be spread far and wide. And I do think it raises this question of, has the government had a really, compelling person at the front other than Anthony Albanese as the spokesperson for a yes case, communicating to those suburban voters? That is the ultimate test. And I think unless there's significant change on that in the coming weeks, it does look very challenging for the yes case.
David and Steph, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks, Jackie.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Jacqueline Maley. This is Inside Politics from Please Explain. Thank you for listening.